True love waits. Stay pure until marriage. It's better to marry than to burn. If you were coming up of age in the late 90s in the evangelical Christian community, those were things you heard a lot. You probably also read I Kissed Dating Goodbye, a popular book touting courtship as the superior way to find God's perfect match for you and avoid the perils of sexual sin. The author of that book is my next guest. His life has changed a lot since he wrote that book, including his view on premarital sex. Today, he's going to share his first person account of what it's like to change your mind about something that you wrote a bestseller about. And we're going to, talk about sex. Fellow 90s kid, rethought and rebranded Joshua Harris. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. That was quite the introduction.
Well, thank you. You know what's funny about all of this that I was thinking about is if we were in our respective communities, two co-eds talking about sex, this conversation would not even be allowed. That
Oh,
just
that's
made me laugh.
true. That is true.
Yeah. And it's really uncommon to see a public figure like change their mind about something unless
Mm,
they're on the canceling chopping block. You know what I mean?
mm,
It would be difficult, especially I think if your identity was connected to whatever it was you were talking about, like yours was, certainly from people who created a career around it. And let's be honest, men are not really known for being like, you know what? I was raw.
it's hard.
It's
Yeah.
so hard.
Yeah.
So tell
It's
me
really
how you
hard.
came to this conclusion about such a major subject for you.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you mentioned the canceling chopping block. And I know you're saying that in kind of a facetious way, but there was a sense in which I was on that block. And I don't always think that's a negative thing, actually, because there were a lot of reasons why it took me a long time to actually engage with the criticisms. And it was the large number of voices that were speaking to me, from the internet, which has enabled what we talk about as cancel culture. But really what it's enabled in many cases is for people to have the power to stand up to authority figures, and in the world of the evangelical church, a lot of times there's not accountability. Leaders and pastors and authors can just sort of do their thing without, anyone calling them to account for the result of their ideas. And it really was a large group of people kind of standing up and sharing their stories that helped to change my mind. But it took a long time. And I understand why so few people do it, because it is incredibly disruptive. It's scary. You mentioned identity. There could be a loss of identity. There's a loss of income. There's, this fear that you'll be rejected by the group of people that used to support you if you shift in some way. So it was a really tough experience. And it wasn't just this like brave, moment for me. Along the way, there were moments that kind of pushed me forward. And then I was like, oh my gosh, should I really, rethink this? And then I did. And then I had to live with the consequences of that. But along the way, I wanted to turn back many times.
So was it a gradual process or was it like all of a sudden all the voices just clicked with you and you're like, because I mean, you're talking about not just a social issue, not just like a girl boy issue, you're talking about a theological issue.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, the big idea of this book that I wrote when I was 21 was because saving sex was the thing that everyone was talking about in the church, and that was the most important issue. If we wanted to be faithful to God and save sex for marriage, then we needed to back up even further and not put ourselves in the position to have the opportunity to get involved emotionally and sexually and so on. And so I took a lot of ideas that were very popular in the homeschool movement and different parts of the church, and I sort of popularized them. I was this young guy that was saying, hey, actually, this is a good idea. We should stop dating. And the book took off and it was embraced by a lot of people. It took almost 20 years before I could see the consequences of those ideas. A lot of concepts that we have or fads that take place in culture, whether it's religion or just the broader culture, you don't really see the implications of them. A book sells, people do the new diet, they sort of move on with their life. But something like dating and relationships and romance and who you marry has really long lasting implications, right? And so there was a whole generation of Christians who embraced the ideas of my book, and then they got married. And then time went by, and maybe those marriages didn't go so well, or maybe some of them never got married, and time went by, and they started to feel, really upset about the bill of goods that they'd been sold in the purity culture movement and in my book in particular. And so part of what happened was that this whole generation started talking to each other and saying, wait a second, why did we think that way? Why did we buy into that? Did this actually work? No, I
Yeah.
married someone that I shouldn't have married, or I didn't date people and get to know the different options that were out there, or whatever it might be. All these different, very human, in some cases, heart-wrenching stories. And for me, there was sort of a breakdown of all the things that I gave my life security. I was a pastor of a large church. Well, that church started to get rocked by, political division and turmoil. We were hit with a sex abuse lawsuit, like all these things that shook my confidence that I was on the right team and I knew, all the right answers began to fall apart. And I started to see, along with other pastors, that there were some real problems in our church culture, not just because of my book, but because of many other issues, the way we tried to control people's lives in such a kind of powerful way. And I started to slowly connect the dots like, wait a second, all these problems in people's lives are tied to the way we've been leading our church. And ideas like my book are connected to that. And so I ended up stepping down from my role to go to seminary on the other side of the continent in Canada. Stepping away from that role as pastor gave me the space to realize I didn't want to be a pastor, gave me the space to question things. I was able to just be a student instead of having to be the leader with all the answers. And so all of those moments led me to that place of being ready to listen to people who said, hey, buddy, do you know that your book actually had a really negative impact, on our lives? And that
Yeah.
was the beginning of a process that became a documentary and this whole, journey of me sitting down and listening to those criticisms and finally being able to see, no, these are not just one-off things. These are not just people who misapplied my book. These are people who applied the ideas in, very faithful ways, and the results were not good for them.
I think I would be remiss if I didn't address the fact that you went to seminary and the end result was that you wanted to leave the ministry. I think that's usually the opposite effect of what happens. Can we touch on that
Mm,
briefly? I know it's not related to our topic, but I feel like it's just the
sure.
elephant in the room.
Well, interesting thing, or the sad thing about the church movement that I was a part of, is that they celebrated not having formal education for their pastors. And so I became a pastor before I went to seminary, before I was formally educated. And it was sort of on the job training. And there was a real celebration of, doing all the theological learning in house. But what it ended up doing is it really gave such a narrow perspective on theology. There was not the opportunity to interact with different theologies and different traditions of the church. So I was a pastor in that group for a long time. And when I got to this point of being completely burned out, I knew I needed a broader perspective. I knew I needed to learn in a different context. So I finally went to seminary after being a pastor for 17 years, which is the opposite way that you're supposed to do things. So it wasn't that this seminary that I went to, it wasn't that it made me not want to be a pastor. It just was more the space in my life to be able to ask the question what I actually wanted. And in that context, I realized, you know what, I've been doing this for a long time and it actually is really, it's draining me emotionally and spiritually. And it's not what I want. And yeah, so seminary led me out of the ministry, but I think it led me to a more kind of faithful, authentic place.
It's funny that maybe those two things are connected, premarital sex and, choosing a mate and choosing a career, because you do have to make space to think about what you want. And, you
Yeah.
know, I am for premarital sex. I'm thinking about having t-shirts made that just say premarital sex and then like one of the Facebook thumbs up. I'll let you know. how that turns out. And one of the reasons is because it allows you to figure out what you want. And,
Mhm.
one of the other reasons that I would love for you to weigh in on is I feel like if you are dating someone and there's a lot of sexual energy, that is clouding your logical thinking,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
And if you are going to legally bind your life with another human for
Mhm.
life, you need all of your faculties in order, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that I think is a reason for it. But I mean, I definitely would love to know, especially, from a theology perspective, did you come across anything that supported that from a theology point of view? Because that's the argument I
Mhm.
mostly hear from people is aside from the practical things, which can be accomplished outside of a marital agreement. It's like, well,
Mhm.
that's God's best for our lives.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely people who are writing works of theology that are arguing for a within the Christian tradition, they're arguing for a much broader perspective on sexuality. They're arguing against this very narrow focus on it only happening within a heterosexual relationship, within, the bonds of marriage and so on. But that is definitely a minority opinion. I mean, I think the reality of the most of the church is that sex is very tied to marriage. Marriage is tied to, the picture of Christ and the church. So there's just all these reasons why free love and, the freedom to experiment sexually and understand what you want and so on is not celebrated by most churches or, kind of backed up by most theologies. And I mean, that's part of the reason for me. I've really stepped away from the church. So I'm not trying to justify my ideas about sex or my affirmation of my LGBTQ plus friends within Christian theology. I've just really stepped away from it and said, listen, I'm not at the same place. I'm not trying to play by all these same rules. But what you're describing earlier is absolutely so true. When you make this rule or when you believe this rule that sex has to happen within marriage, it creates tremendous pressure on unmarried couples who are considering marriage. So many people I've talked to would say, yes, we got married quickly because we were horny, like we wanted to have sex and this was the only way to do it. Or there was so much pressure because everyone around us was so afraid that if we didn't get married quickly, we were going to have sex. So much of even like the Old Testament teaching about sex and virgins and so on was so tied to a view of women in particular that was so property based. It was, you have to make sure that your offspring, they're really your offspring. So the woman has to be a virgin because you want a family succession that's pure and so all those kinds of things. So many of those very ancient ideas have informed what the way that I think many religions, but Christianity in particular, function. And then I would just say there are so many hangups in so many religious contexts about sex. It's become such a massive deal, and then it's been reinforced, as a kind of key part of the culture wars and so on. So there's just incredible pressure, and I think that pressure leads to real problems in the way we relate, problems in the way we even approach sexuality and experience sexuality. I've really interacted with so many couples that have that kind of story, that their sex life is really marred by the guilt that they felt for so long around sex, holding off all those desires and then getting married. And suddenly they're supposed to just turn themselves on sexually and be completely open and comfortable. And it's really a difficult thing to do because your mind has been programmed. This is such a bad thing. It's so terrible. The joke is sex is such a terrible, dirty, nasty thing. You should save it for the one you love.
I haven't heard that. That's good. That's really good. Oh my gosh. And when you said it puts so much pressure on them, let's be real, by them, we mean her, because I don't
Mhm.
know what your experience was, but my experience in my community was it was definitely the woman's job to dress modestly, swim in a t-shirt and shorts,
That's
and
right.
really protect the man's purity because boys will be boys. And then when you got
Mhm.
married, it was like you were expected to also carry the burden of sexual satisfaction and be some sort
Mm,
of super sexual, awesome, knowledgeable person, but we weren't even allowed to masturbate. Like there was no discussion of education, no discussion of
mhm,
pleasure. And you're absolutely right about you know, getting married too soon. I even knew someone, and they're still married amazingly, but they married in high school. They were
yeah,
children because their
mhm,
parents didn't want them to have sex before they got married. But for most of us from my community, we are not married to the person that we first got married to. Like that first marriage, either they're married and maybe it's not the right fit and they're struggling and they're
mhm,
unhappy, and or they parted ways. So it
yeah,
definitely leads to a lot of problems. Hey there. It looks like you're enjoying this episode so far. But you know what's strange? Apple tells me that 19% of you who listen on this app aren't actually following the show. To guarantee that we stay connected in this busy world of podcasts, double check that you've hit the follow button on your podcast listening app. And if you have already, I'd like to invite you to my private Facebook group. Just search MFR Curious Insiders on Facebook or click the link in the show notes to request to join. It's free. Okay, back to the show. I think for anyone who looks back and let's say they're our age, 40-ish, and they look back to their 20s, as long as we didn't write a best-selling book about it, it's pretty easy to go, you know what? I was a moron. But what's hard,
right.
and I would love if you have any like incredible insight on this, what's hard is to look back and mourn lost opportunity.
Mhm,
So for
mhm,
those of us from that community, we're mourning the lost opportunity to be young and carefree in our 20s without daily guilt and shame. We're mourning the lost
mhm,
opportunity of moving away or, different things
yeah,
that were interrupted by marriage, maybe parenthood before they were ready. So if
mhm,
that's something that you experienced and have worked through,
mhm.
please share with the class.
Yeah, I'm so hesitant to just give kind of pat answers or wrap it up with a bow kind of answers, because that is what we get in so many contexts that want us to just sort of shut up and deal with it and move on. And I think the thing that I would just want to say is that regret is real and it's completely valid. And people who have experienced that are you're not alone. There are so many others who have experienced that kind of regret that comes from a very restrictive community, family, religion, whatever it might be. And I think that's what makes something like purity culture in my book such a flashpoint, because some decisions you make, like you got bad advice and you bought the wrong car. Okay, well, get rid of that car and you buy a new one. Well, something like marriage, it just touches so many parts of your life. If it's an unhealthy marriage, extricating yourself from that is so difficult, so painful relationally. If there are kids involved, whatever it might be, or not having gotten married to someone that, I hear that story from people. Like I was dating this person and then because of the standards that everyone had, I ended the relationship. And I look back now and I'm like, I think that was my person, and
Oh.
it's like there's no easy way to fix that. That's just incredibly hard and painful. And I think for me personally, all the ideas of my books, I completely believed in. It wasn't like I was trying to sell that to other people, but I didn't believe it myself. I fully believed it. I lived by it. And I experienced the bad consequences of those very flawed ideas in my own life. And so I can relate to that. I can relate to thoughts of like, why didn't I, go travel the world when I was 21? Why didn't I date, lots of different people and understand myself better? Why was I so fearful? And the only thing that I can do now, and, as a result of that, is to try to live a more honest and free life today. That's the only thing I can do. I've found that endlessly just living in the past doesn't serve me in terms of living in that regret, but I do need to try to take those lessons. And it's not easy because honestly, you'd think, oh, okay, well, you lived through that. Well, now you won't make that mistake. Well, a lot of those patterns are very deeply ingrained. It takes a lot of work for me to actually kind of quiet myself and to, I mean, it's almost like a meditation to be like, what do you actually want, Josh? Like, not what anyone else is saying, not your kids or your friends or the expectations of people. What do you actually want? Like, that's a very difficult muscle for me to exercise because I haven't used it for much of my life. And so it's a learning process, but I have, I'm grateful that I have so many friends. I mean, I've got this little like club of bros that are like all these guys that have gone through divorces and we're like outcasts for a lot of our, old community, but we have these conversations and we talk about what we're learning and we laugh at how we're like, experiencing new things in our lives. And we're kind of like so awkward, like these teens that have never, done certain things, but we're growing and we're learning and we're figuring out what gives us life.
Oh, Josh, we're all in your club, okay?
We're
Yeah.
all in the club.
There's a huge bunch of us from the Midwest, in the United States who are also in your club. Something that was brought up when I was talking to one of my club members, I'm gonna start calling them that. Anyway, then my thoughts have gone in a million direction about what we would call the club, and I need to reel myself back in. But she brought up something interesting that I wanted to run by you. She said that some aspects of your book she felt were still valid, and I wanted to know if you felt that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very tricky question to answer because it has to be very specific about which parts of it are still valid. I would say, it's funny. I have conversations with my son who is single, lives in New York City, and he laughs with me, and he's basically like, I could see there being a revival of the ideas in your book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye now because people are so burnt out on online dating and, that whole world. And I just laugh at that. I'm just like, are you kidding? But I think that some of the things that are relevant in the book is that it's trying to address this question of, you know, endless experimentation and kind of short-term relationship after short-term relationship can really be extremely draining for people who are looking for that long-term commitment with one person. And I mean, I just read an article about how Tinder is 10 years old and now there are so many people that are just like so burnt out on the online dating app game and they just like can hardly take any more of it because they've just come to this place where they don't have any hope of actually finding someone, and yet they're just like swiping through countless, people and so on. So I guess what I'm saying is that there are parts of dating that are quite broken today. I think there's a lot of frustration about it. I think my book was one expression of trying to find a saner, healthier way to approach that. Now, the problem with my approach, it was very control based. It was very guilt based and shame based and so on. But I really think it's important from my own standpoint. I want people to have the freedom to do whatever they want. If there are people who say, I want a very restrictive, my family is involved in who I marry kind of experience of courtship, more power to you. What's important to me is that people are making that decision themselves. It's not being forced on them from anyone else. The same goes with online dating. It's like if you're enjoying that, you're having lots of different sexual experiences and you're having a great time, wonderful. But I hope that's not because there's this pressure from all your friends that you have to be doing this. I just want to encourage people to be free, to know what they want themselves, to be making decisions that are informed by what's best for them and what they kind of feel good about in the way that they're relating to other people. So I think that I Kiss Dating Goodbye was trying to ask some questions. I think the answers that it came up with were wrong, but I think every generation is going to keep having to ask those questions. And as we lose a community-based support system, as we lose the ability to get to know others in contexts that are supported by family and extended community and so on, I think a lot of people feel quite alone and quite frustrated and maybe even scared a little bit by the whole process. And so I worry at times that, the ideas in I Kiss Dating Goodbye will be recycled by someone new. I'm almost positive that's going to happen. But it's
Yeah.
because there's a lot of frustration when it comes to finding a partner, especially in a culture that's quite liberated sexually and so on.
So much frustration. I had some very interesting conversations as part of my research for our
Did you
discussion.
really?
I really
Yeah.
did. And, I can tell like some of them were, I was just like asking, I had like 3 questions I pulled the audience
Mm,
with. And some of them just answered the questions. And then others, they were like, actually, I really want to dig into this. Can we have a Zoom call? I'm like, yeah, I haven't talked to you in 20 years. Let's do that. And it was
wow.
like therapy for us. I love that you say deciding what you want. And for me, that's so key because that's the difference. Because for us, for the ladies of my community, it wasn't about, let me just be a little TMI for a minute. There were
Mm,
women in my community who didn't use tampons because they felt like
mm,
that it would diminish their virginal qualities.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
I've
and
heard
that
of
wasn't
people like that.
because they had biological, anatomical information about
Mm,
virginal qualities. Clearly, it was like a spell. Like, if I'm really pure, if I don't hold
mhm,
hands, if I don't kiss, if I don't think about sex, if I don't masturbate, then
mhm,
I have created the perfect formula that will equal happiness. There was definitely no discussion about like, I will have a good sex life. That wasn't even a part.
mhm,
Surprisingly, I think that maybe got taught on the dude side, but on the girl side, it was about I will be happy, I will be safe, I will be like all the things that you would want from a
yeah.
marriage will
Right.
happen. And so it
Mhm.
obviously created a lot of disappointments because
Yeah.
that has
Of
nothing to
course.
do with anything.
Yeah.
So I love the idea of sitting with yourself and deciding what
Mm,
you want, whether it is in this
mhm,
more traditional Tinder online app dating format or if it has some elements of traditional courtship.
mhm,
So I think
mhm.
that's really powerful.
Well, it's so tied to the family context, right? Like as you're talking about it, the experience of a late 20s single or a mid 40s single after a divorce or whatever is completely different than the teenager who is making decisions for the first time, whose parents care about them, want to protect them from real life consequences that can come from the decisions that are made when it comes to sexuality at this age, that age, that kind of thing. So even as I look back, like I Kissed Dating Goodbye was targeting teenagers. I had just gone through the teen years myself. I was writing to try to inspire teens. And the reasons those very restrictive ideas were so embraced is because there was a whole generation of parents in particular and youth pastors that were wanting to protect their kids from premarital sex because that would lead to unwanted pregnancies and possibly abortion and AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases. That was the focus of that era. So the answer was control. But I was so fascinating because literally last night, my youngest is in AP Euro class in high school. And I start flipping through this textbook, and there's a whole section about like this person writing about views of sexuality in the 1800s.
Really?
And it was talking about the fact that in the upper class in this era, the men had all this freedom. Boys will be boys. It's exactly what we talked about. They're like, of course, guys are going to want to sow their wild oats and do those kinds of things. But in the upper class, the women were protected with ignorance. Like they couldn't know how babies were made. They couldn't know anything about their own bodies. All these kinds of things. Like that was the ideal of feminine virtue. The lower classes were out like screwing around and, having sex and so on because there wasn't the same ability to keep them from that and so on. But I'm just reading this going, oh, wow. Like, these ideas have shaped the Western culture hundreds of years before my silly book showed up on the scene and shaped different parts of Christianity and so on. And they're just out there circulating. And so it's like we're still dealing with the after effects of the tsunami of certain ideas. And and it's hard to change those things. It's hard to change those things at a cultural level.
I got on a rabbit trail of a podcast about the history of prostitution, naturally.
Oh,
Eh,
fascinating.
yeah, and as one does. And all the way back in when the Roman Empire was at its peak, they were
Mm,
really known for sexual exploits. But when
mm,
I'm gonna mess this up, when the emperor became a Christian, they were like, no more human trafficking because he trafficked a lot. And
Oh,
so that was
interesting.
like a positive thing that came through it. But then it turned into exactly what you're discussing as a means of
Mm,
power. And although you said my silly little book, I do think your book, the popularity of your book, I should say,
mm,
really illustrates the disparity between the men and the women. Because
mm,
how is it that I'm going to assume you were 21, so don't take this wrong way. I'm going to assume
mm.
you're sexually unexperienced, like not
That's true.
maybe a
Yeah.
virgin, but maybe not like a dynamo. How is that a sexually unexperienced 21-year-old man writes a book and it becomes like
Mhm,
the basis of so many sermons? And
mhm.
I think the answer is it's because that's how the system works.
Yeah, yeah.
And it
Well, the fact that I was inexperienced sexually was actually a badge of honor and authority. You know what I mean? Like if I had sexual experience, then it would be like, oh, well, you've kind of gone and done your thing, and now you're coming back to being, pure. But in that kind of warped world, that's actually a badge of authority in a ridiculous way. But
Yeah.
yeah, to think about the fact that someone that's that experienced, just even relationally and life experience wise, is writing something that people are shaping massive decisions by is quite ridiculous. But I think it's a common pattern in evangelicalism that, first of all, evangelicalism is very movement based. It's very prone to big waves of ideas that sweep through. Everybody buys the book. Churches are excited about something. We love like our Billy Graham crusades and promise keepers and, all those types of different things. And oftentimes at the forefront of those movements are young adults because young adults have so much passion and fervor. And a lot of times that passion and fervor is, I would say, ignorant. They're young people that are looking for identity and security. And when you're in your early 20s, you have the world figured out. You're arrogant and you're like, what? Why have you guys taken so long to fix this part of the world? You're looking at the previous generation. And you're like, you guys are losers. Like, we're going to be the ones to fix this. This is not that complicated. We just need to be more hardcore. You guys aren't hardcore enough. That pattern is actually repeated in so many different like social movements, not even just religious, in so many different social movements. There's something about that age where you have so much boundless energy, so much optimism, and you're naive. You're naive about human nature. You're naive about your own self. And so, my book, I think, was an example of that. I was at the forefront of that because I was this young guy who was saying all the things that the parents and the pastors wanted somebody to say. And I had more credibility because I was, a single person myself.
Yeah, that's so true. So much to unpack. We've covered a lot of ground, but as we wrap up, I would love for you to speak to how you might wish that the world talk to those young people about sex and
Mm,
sexuality. Having kids yourself and
mm,
having gone through this experience, I'm very
yeah.
curious about your perspective.
Well, I think the thing that I would hope, I'd hope this for my own kids, I'd hope this for others, is just when you take shame and guilt out of the conversation, and when it comes to sexuality, that I think is the healthy place where people understand, where they're able to be educated, where they're able to learn about what gives them pleasure, how they want to interact sexually with other people, where things like masturbation and all those kinds of things there's no shame around them. And people are able to learn about themselves and about what they want consensual sex to look like. That I think is a really powerful place. I would include with that though, kind of an understanding of, listen, this is such a powerful, incredible way to connect with other people. You need to feel that you're in control of this. You need to understand long term, the kind of the pros and cons of all these different paths, whether it comes to marriage and commitment or not commitment or whatever. Like our culture is experimenting with so many different types of things. And not all of that is for everyone. And so for people to have the freedom to say, I'm not really into that, like
Mhm.
I don't really want that. I think that's an important freedom as well. And so I would hope that people could be freed from the shame and guilt of saying sex is bad, but also from the shame and guilt of saying that's not for me. I actually want this over here. Like there's a certain choosing that takes place. And sometimes people will be like, well, why would you want that? And that judgment can come from so many directions. But in that safer place, that's where I think people can be informed, they can learn about themselves, and then they can make decisions knowing that I made these decisions myself, not because someone else was pushing me or forcing me to.
I love that. And I think a life lived with at least one less regret is probably a
Yeah.
positive one on either side. If someone
It is.
wants to continue this train of thought, I know your book is no longer in active printing. You're no longer receiving
Mm,
any financial benefit from the book or from the documentary. What's the
right.
best way for people to kind of explore the subject more or keep in touch with you?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say it's not about keeping in touch with me, honestly. There are so many other people that are writing about this, women in particular. I don't have all the book titles in my mind. There's a great book named Pure that's out there that talks about this in detail. If you just Google purity culture, and books on purity culture, you'll find some really powerful voices that are critiquing these ideas, that are writing about these things. So that's where I'd encourage people to go for more information. It's not me.
Okay. That's fair. That's fair. Well, maybe I can link those in the Saturday email that comes out when this episode
Oh, that'd
airs.
be great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so we can
fantastic.
talk, afterwards and you can be like, "Okay, I thought of the book," and then I'll link
Yeah,
them. So
exactly.
so if you're
There are some
listening
great
to
ones
this
out there.
now and you are not part of that email list, all you have to do, if you're in the US, you can text REAL to 66866, and if you're outside the US, just go to meredithforreal.com and you can get on the list. So that'll be awesome. And you have a website, joshharris.com, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I do a little podcast where I just interview people about business and marketing and different kinds of things like that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This was really awesome.
Oh, Meredith, I'm glad we're in the same club. We'll definitely have to have a chapter meeting one day.
And think of a great name. So to be continued.
Okay. Sounds great.
Thanks for listening. Since you've made it this far, I'd like to invite you to be a part of my private Facebook group. In there, I post content that I don't share anywhere else. You can talk to me directly about past and future episodes, and I even do occasional giveaways. Search MFR Curious Insiders on Facebook or click the link in the show notes. And if you liked this episode, you'll also like the one with the mental health counselor who specializes in religious trauma. That's episode 331. Stay tuned next week when I talk with a functional dentist asking if our spit could be the secret to optimum health. Until then, keep it curious.